This is our third section for federalism. Most of what's in here, like our textbook, does not cover this, but most AP government textbooks do cover a lot more of this. And this is where there's a little bit more of a mixture of the state politics and state and local politics. I use it kind of as a summary of a lot of things that we've had in the past, but where it plugs into somewhat federalism. Some of this is sort of a review of other topics. At the end, I have a very quick part of the advantages and disadvantages. I don't spend much time talking about it in class, much less on this video but this is where a lot of that in your readings and the review packet that I gave to you. So, all right, first thing is about state constitutions. There are some things that must be done. A state must have a republican form of government in which every state has they have separation of powers. They have the three branches. Every state has a bicameral legislature except for Nebraska, which is unicameral, but it still has the legislative branch in that way. They have to have a constitution. State constitutions also have a Bill of Rights. Here in Florida, we will find that our Bill of Rights has even more in depth. One of the moot cases we'll do later on, you'll see what's the Second Amendment, and the U.S. Constitution has even more protections when it comes for the state of Florida and our amendment. Our overall idea for the state responsibilities are usually these are the areas that states are in charge of: education, criminal justice, public health, professional licenses, transportation, economic development. But with many of those, you will see, especially education, health, economic development, that over the last century we have had a lot more expansion of the federal power here that we have. All right, this is the same slide that we had in our very first one, and where you had your pass-fail quiz over these ideas here. But what are the reserve powers? A key thing that I always point out is that the reserve powers are not stated explicitly in the Constitution. The Constitution says what are the national powers. It says what are the prohibited powers. And then the 10th Amendment says that what is not given to the national powers and not prohibited from the states is supposed to belong to the states. So these are the traditional things you have. I mentioned that the AP has traditionally had a question of something, and they try to trick you where they say the 10th Amendment states or specifies the state powers. But again, they do not explicitly state it there. Budgets and taxes, where we're going to have our next section when we get to the policies will be about budgets, and it's going to sound like you're in economics class again. Here, key thing to know, difference between the states and the national governments is that most states have to have a balanced budget. Each year for here in Florida, they have projections when they do the budget, but if we have a downfall in revenue coming to the states, they will tell the schools and other things they have to readjust their budgets. You normally have a little bit of a reserve fund, but they cannot go into debt. A key way to make sure that they take care of pork barrel projects and other things is governors have line item veto. And that way the governors truly have more power to eliminate certain things than the president does with the line item veto. The president does not have the line item veto. For the second time or third time in the notes, Clinton versus New York City case that we had, and what was in your close reading that you have. Revenue sources. States, where the national gets most of their revenue source from income tax. Most states, sales tax is the biggest thing. Some states have an income tax. Actually, most states have an income tax. Florida, we were one of the 7 or 8 states that does not. There's aid that comes from the federal government down to the states. User fees, like if you were to have gas taxes, as well as like hunting license, things like that. Local governments, their number one source is usually property tax. They also get state and federal aid and also user fees. This is kind of interesting for some people where the tax rates, Florida, we're somewhere in the middle that we have, but we're actually seen as a very low tax state because we put a lot of our tax burden on tourists, where we have hotel tax and things like that. But you see some states like New York and California that are traditionally known as some of the highest tax states, Illinois also. But where a lot of people don't realize is Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee, some of those southern states that are also pretty high tax states. On the other end of the spectrum is where does money go? California may have a lot of taxes, and this is where California is actually definitely an outflow state because a lot more money goes to the federal government that comes back. For Florida, we're somewhere in the middle. But you see you go up the Mississippi and Kentucky River, you see a lot of those states that get a lot of federal money. And again, Florida, we're somewhere in the middle, and that's even with a lot of military bases, as well as a lot of retirees. I had this in our elections side, but this is where for governors, it was a trend then for the best path to become president was to be a governor. Today, really don't know. I mean, 2 of our last 3 elections have elected a former senator, and then one other one had a reality TV show host. So governors have not won as much in the last 20 years. So is senators back, where we had a long space between Obama and John F. Kennedy that being a senator wasn't. Being a vice president, so where Biden was a vice president, so was George H.W. Bush. So we've had 2 in the last several decades that have been vice presidents. So again, this is where we're actually a mixture, but for quite a while there, the biggest step will be, and reason being is the power that the governor has showing for his executive branch. This is an introduction. When we get to the judicial branch, we will have a lot more in depth in here, and this is where for federalism, the judicial branch is one of the best examples, because there are some things that are truly state, some things that are truly federal, but there are some things that jump from one to another. This is where the incorporation doctrine has. If I was being charged for murder and it would say, I'm going to fight you all to the Supreme Court, I should say, I'm going to fight you all the way to the Florida Supreme Court. Because unless it has something to do with a right that the incorporation doctrine says, something like a search and seizure or something along the way of due process, it doesn't jump to the federal court. But it could because of that. The 11th Amendment, when we had the amendments quiz early on, this is one that it just clarified a lot of the different things between the states and federal courts. But the biggest thing is the structure of the federal court and the state courts are very similar. The biggest difference will be is that the state courts will have a lot more of your specialized courts, like the family courts, drug courts, teen courts, things like that. A case that we had earlier, and I throw it in here because the College Board loves this case because it checks off a lot of boxes. It deals with elections. It deals with federalism. It deals with civil rights. But the Baker versus Carr case, which is the one person, one vote concept, told states, so the federal government forcing states to redo their apportionment there. Tennessee is where the case took place, but Georgia is usually the better example. Georgia has 107 counties, I believe. It used to be that every county got a representative. But half the people in Georgia live in that little area up there around Atlanta. So those 5 counties would have 5 or 6 representatives, and the rest of the state would have 100 or so. So that was not apportioned correctly. State of Florida makes a big difference. We have 67 counties, but half of Floridians live in Dade, Palm Beach, or Broward County. The political parties. So when we had our political party section, it's kind of a quick review over some things. Realize state parties are independent of national party. Local parties are independent of state parties that you have. So most of the regulation and what parties do is on the state. The state will make more rules for the local levels, but still there is a lot of independence. Certain words you need to remember when you start breaking down is wards and precincts. We don't really have wards here in our area because wards are normally something you think of in a city where you may have a lot of people living in one city block there. And this is where the organization of the party for getting out the votes is very important. A key concept that you have that the federal system supports the two-party system. The reason being is no matter what, you can find some sort of victory. 2016 was seen as a great year for the Republican Party as they won the White House and they kept control of both the House and the Senate there. So were the Democrats dead? No, the Democrats had won a lot of different city mayors, and they are actually in 2016 we're starting to gain back a little bit of control in some of the House and the Senate. So 2020, where the Republicans lost the Senate, they lost the White House. So somebody will say, "Oh, this was a major failure," but the Republicans didn't lose any houses, and they actually cut some of the differences in in the House of Representatives and narrowed the Democrats' lead there. They still hold control about 2/3 of all the different states. So that's why parties can find some place. It's a training ground for leaders, and it still makes it very hard for any minor parties to have any control over this. And that phrase, federalism decentralizes our politics. Again, you can have things that it's not everything coming from Washington, D.C. All right, local governments, make sure that you know, I mean, it seems weird, but a lot of people don't know the word municipalities. It's a city, but a city with a government. So like here in Citrus County, we have many places like Floral City and Homosassa, but the only two true municipalities are Crystal River and Inverness because they have a government. There are a lot of different governments you can have for special governments. In this area, we have the Mosquito Control Board, we have the Southwest Florida Water Management District there. So we have, actually, I think when we were in class, there's 7 governments that could tax you, starting with the U.S. government on down, and we're not as high. Some place like Cook County, Illinois, where Chicago has a lot of governments. There are some places in there they may actually have as many as close to 20 different taxing sources that are coming over them. The one thing that you need to know here for state and local politics that kind of plays over that here is Dillon's rule. This is the idea that the local governments have only the powers that are explicitly given to them by the state, where federalism makes it where there's a lot of questions and a lot of gray area between the states and the federal government. When it goes the other direction for the states, they basically say that the local governments can do only what they want. So it is a little bit more of the power going straight down in that way. See this map, you'll notice that the North and the Midwest are a lot more local, smaller governments, where the South and the West will have bigger counties along the way. All right, this is one of the things we kind of look at. What's one of the major advantages of federalism, and you see that in the quote laboratories, and we had earlier about how federalism can make for each state to be laboratories of democracy. So policy differs from state to state, and how you caught for a problem, you can gear it to what each state does. There's both positives and negatives. A positive you kind of see, I mean, I know recently read that for the vaccine, that West Virginia is actually the state that was doing the best of getting the highest percentage of their vaccine out to their people. So should Florida do what West Virginia's doing? No, I mean, but they can take and learn from different things, and this is why different states can try different areas, and you learn from mistakes of others and what works best. There we are right now, where a lot of northern places like Chicago and New York, they still have not gone back to school from the pandemic, where Florida has been in it and brick and mortar schools now for this whole year. And Governor DeSantis, when it was a controversial decision that way, it was actually turned out that it was the right decision to make. But not everything's perfect. So as these other places open up, they can learn from the mistakes that Florida made, but also what did we do right. But again, there's also some confusion when it's not a uniform policy. Something like the environmental laws that you have, where you could be in one state, or you have different businesses and it's different type of laws from one state to another, and not uniform in that way. Have. All right, state government uniqueness. These are various things that we have had along the way, or maybe will have, that you need to know. The first was actually new here. Term limits, and one of your easiest court cases to ever know, U.S. term limits versus Thornton. And there said that the U.S. government cannot have term limits unless they change the Constitution. So they can have term limits for a president because the 22nd Amendment says so, but you cannot have term limits for representatives and senators. What happened in the 90s is we had a lot of states that were passing term limit laws, and they were allowed to do that for the state, but they could not do it for federal. So for example, for Florida, if you are a state representative, you can only serve 8 years, or a state senator, it is an 8-year term limit. But for the U.S. representatives, they do not have this there. So that's the court case you need to know. Once again, line item veto. Governors have this power, or most governors have it, but president does not. Clinton versus City of New York, remember it. The merit plan is something we will have a little bit more in the future. This is sometimes it's called the Missouri plan, but when we had the Judicial Branch, where the federal government, if you are a federal judge or a Supreme Court justice, it is a life term. you don't truly vote with states that have the merit plan or the Missouri plan, but it does give some power to the people. Here in Florida, every 6 years a judge goes on the ballot there, and again, they're not running against another person, but there is a question of should Judge Smith retain his position on the Court of Appeals or the Florida Supreme Court, and it's a yes or no question. So it's not a true election, but at the same time there is a little bit more accountability in that way. And states can also have some sort of age limit. We have a retirement age for our Supreme Court justices in the state of Florida. All right, the U.S. versus the state constitutions. Every state has their own constitution, but because of Article 6, the Supremacy Clause, the U.S. Constitution is supreme. It is a lot easier to add amendments to state constitutions. When we went over the whole idea of the initial petition and then referendums, Florida, we actually have one of the easiest ways. That's where we actually have an amendment to our Constitution saying you cannot have a pregnant pig inside of a box smaller than X by Y in there. So that is actually an amendment in our Constitution because, again, it is easier. Going back to our very first unit there, Northwest Ordinance in 1787, that set the rules for how a state can apply to become, or a territory can apply to be a statehood. It's the rules that we had for Kentucky in the beginning all the way to today. If a District of Columbia or Puerto Rico or Guam decide to, they have to follow those rules that were made back when we had the Articles of Confederation. All right, the advantages of federalism. I have the list here. In your review packet, there's another list, but this is where I strongly encourage you to make sure that you are doing some reading over the sections to go into the in-depth side in here. But that whole diversity side is something that we have in it. The part that we had about training ground for leader, where governors can do this, where there's multiple levels to make changes for things. So the idea that if you're an environmentalist, that you don't have to just go to Washington, D.C. You can go to the state of Florida, Citrus County, Inverness. Along the way, there's different places that you can make difference in here. That's the idea that's close to the people. There's multiple access. One thing we haven't gone into here is where we did adapt from our original system. The Articles of Confederation, changing the Constitution, was a peaceful transition that we have. The idea that local issues are solved at a local area. The innovative ideas, that's that whole idea that we are laboratories of democracy. The regional autonomy, what's meant by that is that different areas of the country can kind of work together on common problems. So like we have areas rivers that go through more than one state. For Florida, you have the Apalachicola River that is part of the network that goes with the Flint and the Chattahoochee River. So Florida, Alabama, and Georgia have regional autonomy to ruling over that area. The disadvantages, if you want to think in here, this is where a lot of this is the whole thing for bureaucracy. Because there's so many different levels, it's great that people can make changes on it, but it's also inefficient and there could be duplication of this. The idea there's different regulations in different states. You're traveling up I-95 and you want to have your radar detector in South Carolina when there's an area where there's a long stretch of that's nothing but bridges that you can go flying over. But you better make sure when you get to Virginia that radar detector is out there because it's against the law there. So conflict of who's in charge. Is it Florida? Is it the Florida government there? Have we got our loose strict interpretation debate that we have? Here's where it's at. We just have too much government and too much bureaucracy because of federalism. And please read your book and read more in depth in here. Advantages and disadvantages is reoccurring explain type questions. Give examples, okay, when you are writing of these things that you have.